Hi there, grade 5s. Welcome back to WorksheetCloud.com and to your natural science lesson. My name is Mrs. Niverson and I am looking forward to running with your lessons for you this week. I hope you had a lovely weekend, a restful one, and are ready and raring to get going. A reminder to you all of our email address, that's grade5@worksheetcloud.com. If you have any questions, if you'd like to share anything with me, or you'd like to show me some of your work. Now, we ended off last week's lessons having looked at habitats and the adaptations of animals and plants that live in different habitats. We then moved on to start looking at food chains, and we're going to continue with that today. So I want to see if you can remember some of the words that we learned last week, because I know as well as most of your teachers will too, that after a weekend your brains can be a bit rusty and you can have forgotten some of the things you've learned previously. So, looking at the pictures in front of you, I have asked you the question, what do those organisms all have in common? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it. What do those organisms all have in common? Well, they are all producers. And that is a word we learnt last week, and a producer refers to the first item in a food chain. They are your plants because they carry out a process called photosynthesis, and you should have learnt a little bit about that in grade 4. But remember, a producer is an organism that gets its energy from sunlight using photosynthesis. So it doesn't need to eat anything else in order to get energy. Now, with that in mind, I wonder if you can guess what these organisms have in common. Have a close look at them and think about what they eat. Right, the panda probably gave it away in the bottom corner there, but these are all herbivores. They are our primary consumers, okay? So herbivores are animals that get their energy and nutrients from a diet that consists exclusively of plants. Okay, so they are called our primary consumers because they then are the next level up after the producers. They consume and the producers, and they are the first in the food chain. Okay, you should probably guess where this is going now, but what about these organisms here? That's right, they are our carnivores. They are the secondary consumers. They consume the herbivores. Okay, so if you're thinking of a food chain, we have our producer, followed by our primary consumer, which is our herbivore, followed by our secondary consumer, which is our carnivore. Remember, a carnivore is an animal that obtains its energy and nutrients from a diet consisting mainly of animal tissue. Okay, so they are predators. Okay, so we've had our producers, our primary consumers, our secondary consumers, but what about these animals here? What do they have in common? And you'll notice that we even make an appearance. That's right, the human species. Well done if you've been shouting at your computer screen the word omnivore. We are consumers, only plants, remember, are producers, but omnivores are animals that get their energy and nutrients from a diet consisting of both animals and plants. Okay, so we can appear both as a primary consumer or a secondary consumer depending on the food chain. And just keep in mind, and I want to reiterate this from our last lesson, that some of you at home may not be meat eaters. You may not consider yourself an omnivore because you have made the decision to be either a vegetarian or a vegan. Well, I just would like to remind you that that is a choice you have made in your lives or your parents have made for you. Okay, so scientifically speaking, as a species, humans are considered omnivore, but some people make an informed decision to become non-meat eaters. That is where the words vegetarianism or veganism come in. Right now, I'm going to really extend your knowledge here and throw in one final classification of animals. And I want you to have a little look at the creatures on your screen. These organisms have something in common as well, but we didn't go over this last week, and technically it's not something you need to know in grade 5, but I always say, why do we need to always just stick to the curriculum? Let's expand it. So can you think about, even if you're not sure what the specific word is, but can you think about what these animals have in common when it comes to their diets? Well, they have a very special name. Their name is detrivores. They are consumers because, remember, only plants are able to be producers. But a detrivore is an animal that gets its energy and nutrients from a diet consisting of dead or decomposing organic matter. So it doesn't need to be dead animals. It could be dead plants, like leaves on the ground, things that are rotting. So worms in a compost heap. But that's the classification of those animals. So you have producers, consumers, primary consumers, secondary consumers. You also have herbivores, omnivores, carnivores. And now you can tell your teachers when you go back to school that you know of something called a detrivore. Those are animals that eat decomposing organic matter. Okay, then now that we have recapped those words, let's think about what we're going to learn today. Well, I've not put any new learning objectives up for us today because the objectives stay the same. We're going to extend our knowledge of food chains, but this time we're going to look at how they can be broadened into something called a food web. And terminology-wise, well, you have all of the terminology you need to use. You know what a predator is. You know what a prey animal is. You know consumers and producers, herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores. But there is one very special word that we use when we talk about food chains and food webs, and it is this word here, ecosystems. Now, very, very simply put, an ecosystem is similar to the word habitat. But whereas a habitat refers purely to the living organisms that live there, an ecosystem is everything that makes up a place. Okay, so every ecosystem, there are living organisms and non-living organisms. So if I get rid of this screen here now, and I think about what living and non-living organisms could be found in a natural ecosystem, anything living, the plants, the animals, the decomposers, though decomposers would be things like your bacteria and things like that, yeah? They all are living and they all make up the ecosystem, but they also, in that ecosystem, have things such as the sun, the soil, the water, the air, the rocks, the sand, the climate, all make up an ecosystem. Okay, so whereas a habitat refers purely to the place that an animal or a plant lives, the ecosystem is very much in more detail everything that is there. Now, of course, every ecosystem will have its own food chains. Now, let's remind ourselves how a food chain starts. Well, generally, at the beginning of a food chain, you should find the sun. Now, we don't always ask you to include the sun in the food chain because you start with your producer that uses the sunlight to make its energy. But the sun really does start a food chain. Remember, the arrows in a food chain show who is eating who, and they point in the direction of the flow of energy. So next from the sun comes your producers, your plants. Remember, photosynthesis is the process they use in order to make energy from sunlight. Following on from them I have my primary consumers, the herbivores. Those are the ones that eat the plants. Following from them in my food chain, I have my carnivore, my secondary consumer, okay? So here is a very, very simple food chain. The sun going to the plants, which are eaten by the rabbit, who is eaten by the wolf. Now, as we just said, food chains follow one single path as each animal eats each other. So the grass is eaten by the grasshopper is eaten by the frog is eaten by the snake, and the snake is eaten by a hawk. It almost reminds me of that storybook, you know, the little old lady that swallowed the fly, and then she swallowed the spider to catch the fly, then she swallowed the bird to catch the spider. It's one big long food chain, really. So remember, just as this example and the one you saw previously on the other slide, a food chain is one single thread. It's one line where you follow one animal to the next, to the next. So have a little look at the pictures on the screen in front of you. And I wonder if you could move them around. Now, you're obviously not going to move them on your screen. You're going to do it in your head or on a piece of paper to create 3 separate food chains. Now, I'm going to ask you to pause your video while you do that. And then in a second, when you unpause, I'll show you the 3 that I came up with. Okay, so the 3 that I came up with. Let's start. I'm going to start with a food chain. And remember, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my bears and my foxes, all my animals, to one side. And I'm going to start my food chains with my plants. Here we go. Why? Because they are my producers. Okay, so I've got my plant here. I'm going to say that this is an underwater plant, okay? Or no, it doesn't even actually need to be. It can be on the water, and it is eaten and consumed as it decomposes by my worm. The worm is then gobbled up by a hungry fish, and that fish is then eaten by my bear. Okay, what about the grass here? Well, I know that cows eat grass, so I can have the grass being eaten by the cow, and this man here having a steak for his dinner and eating the cow. And lastly, I've got this one here. I could have this being eaten by the rabbit, who is eaten by the fox. Okay, now there's one very important thing missing from my diagram, and that is arrows. And remember that arrows need to show the flow of energy, so they must go from the producer all the way down to the last animal in the food chain. Okay, there we go. It's my omnivore, and this one is going to my herbivore and to my carnivore. There you go. Okay, so if that's a food chain, then what is a food web? Well, a food web show how many animals are interconnected by different paths. So what I want you to remember is that in one ecosystem, you can have many different herbivores and many different carnivores, and they eat and survive on lots of different things. So trees make acorns, which could be eaten by both mice and insects. Can also be eaten by a squirrel. Because there are many mice and insects, weasels, snakes, and raccoons can have food. Also, insects attract birds, skunks, and possums. When the birds, skunks, mice, and possums are around, hawks, foxes, and owls can find food. And so on and so forth. They are all connected. So here is a diagram of a food web. And you can see, remembering that the arrows show the energy path. At the top here, I have my carnivores, my predators. Okay, and at the bottom here, just above the grass, the producer, I have got my herbivores, my primary consumers. So here I've got the rabbit eating the grass and the fox eating the rabbit. But foxes don't just survive on rabbits, they also can eat squirrels, mice, and some birds. Over here, I could have a herbivorous, which means a herbivore insect, being eaten by a carnivorous insect, something like a spider, then being eaten by a smaller bird, who is eaten by a larger bird, and so on and so forth. But they all exist within the one ecosystem. So knowing that's how food webs work, basically a very large, expanded, interlinked diagram of different food chains, can you create your own food web with the 6 organisms in front of you? So you're going to draw arrows to show the relationship between the animals of this ecosystem. Okay. Now you can we'll do this one together because it might get a little confusing. So I'm going to start, obviously, like I start with all food chains, with my producer, and I'm going to look at these animals and decide which ones are my primary consumers, my herbivores. Well, they would be the mouse. Excuse me, I have to click to turn my arrow. There we go. And my rabbit. Okay. Now, who is going to be eating the rabbit? Well, I don't think the bird will be eating the rabbit, but the fox will be. So there's one food chain. Okay. Producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer. Who's going to be eating the mouse? The snake. Well, now I've got producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer. Okay, and some snakes can be eaten by birds. So I can have the arrow from the snake. Oh, if I can get it to turn. There we go. From the snake to the bird. Some birds also eat mice. Let's turn this arrow and I can have this one going directly across here. Oh, I don't like it when we cross a picture, but never mind for this example. Yeah, and you can even sometimes have some snakes, if they're not poisonous, otherwise they'll be left alone generally, being eaten by some foxes. Can you see now how the food chains become a more interwoven web? Well, now that we've done one together, I wonder if you can attempt this one. So this one, I've got some underwater creatures. So here I have various creatures and a producer, and let's see if you can put the arrows to show the connections in the food web. Take a second to pause the video while you do this. Well, let's see what I can come up with now that you've had a go on your own. So I'm going to obviously start with my producer, which here is some water weeds of some kind being eaten by the dragonfly, who in turn can be eaten by the fish, a carnivorous fish, who is then eaten by the penguin, who is then eaten by the orca. And there's one food chain within the food web. I could also have it that the plant is eaten by this fish, who is an omnivore, and he also eats the dragonfly. Okay, he himself can be eaten by the penguin, or down here, come here you, my arrows don't want to play with me today, by the carnivorous fish. And you can see how this can get very complex very quickly based on one single ecosystem. Now, at the end of today's lesson, you can go on to WorksheetCloud.com. Underneath my video here, you will see I've posted an activity for you to do where you can draw and answer questions based on food webs and food chains, as well as ecosystems and habitats. So to make sure you are ready to do those activities, I thought we'd play a little game. Now, what I have behind this grid is a picture. And if we can answer the questions correctly, we'll each reveal the square portion of the picture and you can tell me what scene it is. So let's not go in order. Usually if I was in the classroom, I'd have the children shout out which number they would like, but I'm going to start. Let's go with number 6 to start with. Right. What is an organism that eats meat and plants called? It's an omnivore. I was a bit quick there, wasn't I? I should have given you a little bit of time to think, but I know you know that anyway. But let's go back. It is an omnivore. Ah, I have a picture of a fox underneath that tile. Okay, let's try number 1 now. The place where organisms live is called, be careful here because you can get them confused quite easily. It's a habitat. I waited a bit longer then, that was better. Remember, can be confused with an ecosystem, but a place where an organism lives is its habitat. Right, how about number 11? A herbivore in a food chain is known as a primary consumer. If you said consumer, I'm happy, but remember, because they are the ones that eat the plants, the producers, they're the primary consumers. Okay, how about we go up to number 3 now? What is the name of the process in which a producer makes its own food? I've said this about 3 or 4 times this lesson, so hopefully you were paying attention. It's photosynthesis. Let's go to the bottom corner. The habitat, together with the community of microorganisms, plants, animals, and non-living objects, is the ecosystem. Remember, everything that makes up that particular environment is the ecosystem. Right, number 5. Let's finish this. That's obviously a tree, isn't it? Let's finish it. An organism that eats only meat, flesh or fish, is called a carnivore. How about number 8, the last blue tile? An animal that is hunted and eaten by predators is called prey. Number 2. Which organism begins the food chain and makes its own food? A producer. I will also accept if you said plants because they're one and the same. Many food chains are linked together, are called, we've just this second been looking at it, a food web. Okay, now let's go to number 7, the last one in the middle. An organism that hunts and kills other animals for food is called what? A predator. All right, number 4 up in the top corner. An organism that only eats plants. So we've had the carnivores, we've had the omnivores. This must be, oh, my click's not coming, but we know it is the herbivore. And finally, my last question is actually something I've not done with you today, but I just wanted to see if you could apply the knowledge and answer it. The total of one species, the total number of one species that lives in a particular area is called what? It's a little bit of social science really for you, mixed in now with your natural science. Oh, didn't get the answer then. Oh, what happened? It is population. So the total number of a species living in an area is called a population. So you might ever hear, if you watch wildlife shows, you might hear David Attenborough or so, someone saying that the population of a particular species is X, Y, and Z. Okay? Now there's my picture of my woodland scene, and maybe if you'd like an extra challenge, you can take that picture now, freeze the video, and create for me a food web of those animals. So thanks once again for joining me, grade 5. I hope I have helped you understand food chains, food webs, and ecosystems a little bit better today. and I will hopefully see you again tomorrow to do some more natural science. Have a lovely day and rest, and please stay home, stay safe, and stay healthy.